Hello and welcome to the Beyond podcast. I'm your host, Robert Crichton, and today we're discussing Robert Greene, word producer extraordinary, whose dramatic canon is a little wobbly round the edges. Now, whilst the repertoire of playing companies expanded in size and scale in the mid-1570s to 1590s, the printing of that repertoire ran a little behind, so many of the plays that were printed in occasional flurries up to the 1590s often don't give us names of who wrote them, and sometimes if they did, not quite sure how accurate that is, and often it's a little difficult to decipher precisely what's going on. It's not unusual for any play within this window of time to be ascribed to Greene, Peele, Lodge, Marlowe, or any other random contemporary who've sat within spitting distance of a quill. My guest today will be talking about how to firm up our ideas of Robert Greene's work within this swirl of data. So please introduce yourself to the listeners at home. Who are you and what is your purpose in life?
I'm Darren Freebury-Jones and I'm a lecturer in Stratford-upon-Avon. So my role involves teaching groups at all levels worldwide. So sometimes you'll get groups will travel from the States or from Germany or Singapore and so forth, and I lecture to them in Stratford-upon-Avon itself. Or sometimes you find yourself zooming across the world into a lecture theatre or a classroom. But my background is in corpus linguistics and authorship attribution studies. So my PhD at Cardiff University in 2016 was on the canon of Thomas Kyd. And what's my academic purpose in life? Alongside teaching, the research I do is it doesn't form part of my job role. I very much do my academic research by candlelight in the evenings or on the odd weekend. And though it informs my teaching, I think my chief aim for this extracurricular work is to broaden knowledge of early modern playwrights, their canons and how they influenced and worked with each other.
Excellent. So we're talking about Robert Greene, born in Norwich. We always like an East Anglian connection. In 1558, went to Cambridge and Oxford, wrote a lot of books, pamphlets, and of course plays, and has, since his death, some people have created some unfair representations, perhaps, of his life. So let's start with a bit about his life. Who was Greene, and is it fair to say he lived an unsavoury life?
Well, most of the unsavoury details we have about Greene come from pamphlets written by his arch rivals, or even by himself. And it's worth bearing in mind that the authorship of some of these pamphlets isn't clear-cut. And my focus has been on recovering Greene's reputation as a dramatist rather than a prolific pamphleteer, for which he is chiefly known. Now, authorship issues with pamphlets attributed to Greene aside, I think my colleague Stanley Wells is right in noting that Greene was so much a master of the journalistic skill of turning anything that happened to him into copy for the printers that it's difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction in his writing. So if we take a look at Greene's pamphlet, The Repentance of Robert Greene, which was printed in 1592 and is written in the first person, we find that Greene claims that he married a gentleman's daughter, but deserted her when she bore him a child. So she returned to Lincolnshire while he settled in London. So from the horse's mouth itself, you've got some unsavory details there. And Greene apparently had a son named Fortunatus by his mistress, who was the sister of a thief and cutthroat with the amazing name, Rob, of Cutting Ball. And Cutting Ball was hanged at Tyburn, while Fortunatus died almost a year after his father. And Greene himself died on the 3rd of September, 1592, probably age 34. And his death and burial were announced by his rival, Gabriel Harvey, who in 4 letters and certain sonnets, that work was printed in 1592 as well, attributed Greene's demise to a surfeit of pickled herring and Rhenish wine. And Harvey claimed that Greene had been buried in a churchyard near Bedlam on the 4th of September. So we should be wary of embellishments in terms of evidence about Greene's life, especially as Greene might have been writing something akin to biofiction, inserting a fictional version of himself into his pamphlets to explore themes such as repentance, to offer just one example.
Yeah, I can't actually remember where I got the quote "unsavory life" from. I was just literally scrambling around books going, I know I picked that from someone, probably writing in the late 19th century, in a really judgmental fashion, but I suddenly can't find the quote. So, yes, it is Greene. We've got a woodcut of him sitting in what looks like to be a banana.
Yes, I love that image, either a banana or an ear of corn, but he looks comfy. It kind of looks like the early modern equivalent of a slanket, I think.
Yeah, some form of winding sheet, late night, keeping himself nice and warm while he's beavering away on texts. So yes, he obviously also wrote plays, which is our primary focus, our primary concern, and the extent of his canon. And this is where it gets a bit wibbly-wobbly around the edges, because some people agree or disagree as to what he wrote or who he wrote with what. So we have, shall we say, the main five. Some people disagree on the edges of this main five, but the main five are fairly well established, the works that are more clearly attributed to his canon. So we have the plays Alphonsus, Friar Bacon, Friar Bungay, Orlando Furioso, James IV, and co-authored with Thomas Lodge, A Looking Glass for London and England, all of which I should note that we've done as exploring sessions on our YouTube, that you can view our various stages of exploration through those texts. So we're pretty certain about these five. What do you find that's particularly green about these five, and what do you have to say about any or all of them in passing?
Well, I think it's always worthwhile starting with the external evidence when we're thinking of authorship attribution. So we've got the heroical romance, the comical history of Alphonsus, King of Aragon, and that play is dated 1587 by Martin Wiggins, the leading authority on early modern play chronology. And that play was printed in quarto form by Thomas Kyd in 1599, most likely from authorial copy. And the title page attributes the play to R.G. So we have Greene's initials there, and Greene's authorship of the play is rightly uncontroversial, I think. And then we have Greene's second surviving sole-authored play, dated 1589 by Martin Wiggins, The Honourable History of Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. And that was published in 1594, with the title page attributing the play unequivocally to Robert Greene, Master of Arts. And the title page notes that it was played by Her Majesty's servants, referring to the Queen's Men Acting Company, a company founded in 1583 at the express command of Queen Elizabeth herself. And Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, with its fusion of a love story between Prince Edward, the Earl Lacy, and the beautiful daughter of a gamekeeper, Margaret of Fressingfield, and popular traditions concerning Roger Bacon's magical skills, remains Greene's most enduring dramatic text today. And then in the same year, 1589, according to Martin Wiggins, we have A Looking Glass for London and England, on which Greene collaborated with Thomas Lodge. And that play was entered in the Stationers' Register in 1594, was printed again by Thomas Kyd, and was attributed to Thomas Lodge and Robert Greene, gentlemen. So again, another fairly unequivocal authorship attribution. And interestingly, A Looking Glass for London and England might not have been Greene's first biblical play. There's a play called The History of Job, and that play title appears in a list of manuscripts that were supposedly lost when the antiquarian John Warburton's cook, Betsy Baker, used these precious pages as pie dish linings. And the play is listed as The History of Job, by Rob Greene. And that play was, again, almost certainly a biblical drama, this time drawing from the book of Job in the Bishop's Bible. And
the last thing anyone wants to see in their notes is Warburton's servant down the edge, because you just know. Oh, well, allegedly. I mean, we only have his word for that.
Yes.
Surely.
You should listeners should check out David McInnes's book, Shakespeare and Lost Plays, Reimagining Drama in Early Modern England. And David McInnes has some thoughts on that anecdote concerning Betsy Baker and whether she was wholly to blame for the loss of all these precious pages.
So yes, I cut you off before we got to our last couple of plays on this list.
Well, I was just going to talk about the internal evidence for a looking glass for London and England. I'll elaborate on internal evidence when it comes to Greene's canon shortly. So in A Looking Glass for London and England, Greene and Lodge drew from the Book of Jonah in the Old Testament in order to tell the story of God's warnings to the people of Nineveh, a city of sin that the dramatists repeatedly linked to Elizabethan London. And the authorship of this play has been largely neglected by attribution scholars, but my researches suggest that Greene took care of much of the plot involving Rasnai and the comic business with the clown Adam, whereas Lodge contributed the scenes involving the usurer as well as Jonah. So we learn here that the authors worked according to plot and character as opposed to dividing their labor by acts. And I think it was a very successful partnership, actually. It's stylistically very homogenous text, and one of my favorite plays in the Greene canon, actually. I think it's a wacky romp, and I find it quite hilarious that Greene and Lodge are offering warnings to London commercial audiences about sinning, whilst also offering popular entertainment. It's kind of like the play equivalent of an early modern sermon, I think. It's providing entertainment through the decadence of the characters on stage, isn't it? Particularly that clown role of Adam. And then there's a certain degree of finger wagging at the end of the play.
Moving on to, as I say, the last two relatively solid canonical plays, as it were.
So we've got 1590, according to Martin Wiggins. We've got James IV, also known as The History of James IV, which, despite its title, isn't a history play at all. It's a romantic drama of love and adultery with comic interludes. And the plot of this play involves the king intending to murder his wife so he can court another woman, Ida, the daughter of the Countess of Arran. And James's wife, Dorothea, disguises herself as a man in order to escape and encounters a jealous nobleman whose wife finds her disguise charming, to put it euphemistically. And at the conclusion of the play, Dorothea and James are reunited, and she forgives, her husband who intended to murder her. And James IV was entered in the Stationers' Register on the same date as Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, the 14th of May, 1594. But the earliest edition of the play was printed in 1598 by Thomas Kyd, who was also, as we've seen, responsible for bringing Greene's Alphonsus, King of Aragon, and A Looking Glass for London and England to print. And the 1598 edition of James IV attributes the play to Robert Greene, Master of Art, which duplicates the ascription in the 1594 quarto of Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. And the edition claims that James IV hath been sundry times publicly played, but there's no record of the play's performance, although it's likely that Greene intended it for the Queen's men. And last, but certainly not least, dated 1591 by Martin Wiggins, we have Orlando Furioso, which was entered in the Stationers' Register in 1593 and was first printed the following year. And the title page notes that the play was played before the Queen's Majesty, but provides no authorial attribution. However, in his pamphlet, Defence of Coney Catching, Greene is charged with selling the play firstly to the Queen's men and then to the Admiral's men. So when it comes to the canonical five, I think they're all firmly attributed on the basis of external evidence. And my examination of these plays shows them to be stylistically consistent as well, to the extent that Greene's sole author plays are so stylistically consistent that we can analyse his co-author play, A Looking Glass for London and England, with Thomas Lodge, and I think work out what Greene's contributions were with a fairly high degree of success, I like to think.
Excellent. So we have the core five, as it were, and then we have ones where we're a bit shakier. We have the other ones. In the firing line, we have the sequel to Friar Bacon and Friar Bunky, John of Bordeaux, which is missing some bits and bobs. We have the super Georgia Greene, which I will be gutted if it isn't by Greene. So, you're trampling on my dreams, by the way. We just love as a play anyway, so that's fine. Selimus and Anactono and Knave, and even Locrine. Which of these have you found fit with Greene's known canon, and which are a no? Basically, is it a yes from you, or is it a no? As I say, treading on my dreams, it's fine. Yeah. So John of Bordeaux first. Thoughts on?
John of Bordeaux, I'm inclined to say a no. I think with that play, it's another example of Stranger's Men, the playing company Lord Stranger's Men, seeking to duplicate the success of Greene's efforts, and that's something I discovered was, firstly, I think Greene wrote exclusively for the Queen's Men playing company, even if he later sold Orlando Furioso to Admiral's Men, and I think that has important implications when we're thinking of Elizabethan repertoires. But what I've discovered is that other playing companies were really trying to riff off the success of Greene's plays. And I think we should recognize Greene as a much more commercially viable, enticing and successful playwright than is often credited. So I think John of Bordeaux is Lord Stranger's Men play that's seeking to capitalize on the success of Friar Bacon and Friar Bunky. And the manuscript for that play contains evidence of several hands, including Henry Shettle, who added an 11-line speech for the character of John of Bordeaux. So that play begins with a visit from Friar Bacon to the German Emperor Frederick II, and Bacon tells him that desire of deeper skill may be coast unto the German clime. And the emperor's son Ferdinand desires Rosalind, the wife of John of Bordeaux, who is a valiant soldier. And the magician Vandermast helps Frederick to frame John, who is subsequently banished by Frederick. And Ferdinand attempts to seduce Rosalind with the aid of Vandermast's magic. We might remember Vandermast from Greene's earlier play. But these magical plots are consistently scuppered by Bacon's superior magic. And I found that decision to set the play in the Italian city of Ravenna very interesting, and to depict Turkish invaders attempting to besiege that city, because I think that has implications that are repertorial rather than authorial. Elizabethan audiences seem to have really craved similar religious conflicts in exotic locations, as we can see in plays such as George Peele's The Battle of Alcazar, and Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, of course. But what I found particularly pertinent in terms of internal evidence was that whoever wrote John of Bordeaux recalled the phraseology and the dramatic situations in which phrases occurred in Friar Bacon and Friar Bunky, but not Greene's other plays, which I think is a telltale sign for imitation, and is quite unlike results I obtained for Greene's attested plays, where Greene is able to draw from his phrasal storehouse from a variety of different plays. You get the sense that whoever wrote John of Bordeaux was very familiar with Friar Bacon and Friar Bunky, but not Greene's other texts. And that, alongside a variety of other forms of internal evidence, strongly suggests to me that John of Bordeaux is not a Greene play as such,
from not a Greene play to Georgia Greene. Is Georgia Greene a Greene play? I mean, his name's in the title, so it's just on a marketing level, it's just we have no skin in this game, so we don't really mind. But it's just for comic effect. But yes, Georgia Greene, yes or no?
It's a great point about the title. I'm inclined to say no. When it was first printed in 1599, the edition tells us that it was performed by Sussex's men at the Rose Playhouse in 1593. So not a Queen's Men company, for whom I argue Greene wrote all of his plays. And what you were saying about the title is interesting in itself, because you have George Buck, Master of the Revels, recording on the quarto title page that Edward Dubia, a player and actor, believed the play to have been written by Greene. But as Martin Wiggins points out, it's easy to take the ascription to Greene as no more than a title-inspired guess. And I think it is a super fun play. And the Robin Hood comedy genre is a wonderful genre, but unfortunately, I don't think Greene contributed to it on stage, because that play failed almost every test I conducted when you're looking at the cold hard data, but thinking of things from a more traditional literary critical approach. When I was looking at like shared phrases in context, I found very little indication of Greene's thought processes. So I think I've provided some pretty hefty evidence that we have to dislodge this play from Greene's canon. And I know it's going to take a hardy editor to not include that play were there to be another edition of Greene's works. But I think the evidence against Greene's authorship is far, far stronger than the evidence in favor of it.
So Salamis, is that a yay or a no? Nay?
So Salamis is a particularly interesting example, I think, because you had scholars like Alexander B. Grossart making a really wide-ranging case for Greene's authorship. And Grossart observed that the initials on the title page of the play, that play was attributed to T.G. In a second edition of 1638. He argued that might be an unlucky misprint for R.G. Now, although scholars have contended for Greene's sole authorship of this play, my evidence reveals it to be another co-authored effort between Greene and Thomas Lodge. So maybe that unlucky misprint arose due to the conflation of the initials T.L. And R.G. Would you like me to expand on some of the internal evidence I found in favour of co-authorship, Rob?
Yeah, because I have to say it does feel like there's two hands at work. Especially as the dating does put it relatively close to some early onset death for Greene. So there's an interesting sort of question about how the work comes together as well, in terms of how much work could Greene have done on it if its dating fits around where it is. But yes, go more. Yes, please.
Interesting points there, actually, because I would suggest that Salamis is Greene's last surviving play, dated around 1591 by Martin Wiggins. And I think there's a nice circularity, actually, where you've got a play riffing off those Turk motifs that we also find in Alphonsus, King of Aragon. But the most telltale sign for Lodge's hand, I think, is that Lodge has this habit of writing really lengthy rhyming combinations, which are completely alien to Greene's dramas. So one of the things I've done during the course of my research is record every single rhyme combination and rhyming pattern in all of Greene's plays. And what I found is that a lot of the rhyme forms in Salamis are utterly alien to Greene's dramas, but do point towards Lodge's poetic ear and his special interest in experimental prosody. And I think that that rhyming experimentation might be appropriate for Lodge's poems. But you might recall from your readings of Slimas that several passages of the play are quite stiff and archaic. I think Lodge's rhyming patterns lend an even stronger air of artifice to the bombastic iambic verse, especially in the earlier passages of the play. And another habit that Lodge has is he frequently employs epistrophe, not only as part of his lengthy rhyming sequences, but also to conclude speeches in his one surviving solo-authored play, The Wounds of Civil War, such as in Anthony's lines, "'Twere better still learn to mend in Rome than Marius come to tyrannize in Rome." And crucially, the distribution of phrases that are only found in Slimas and Lodge's play, The Wounds of Civil War, which is a historical biographical drama dealing with the ancient Roman conflict between Marius and Sulla, falls almost perfectly into passages consisting of rhyming patterns never used by Greene. So when we're thinking about the distribution of labor here, I think that Lodge was responsible for the opening of Slimas, Looking Glass for London and England. And Greene seems to have taken over to depict the battle scenes and the subsequent victory of Bajazeth's forces. And I also assigned to Lodge some of the nastiest passages in the play, such as those involving Aegon, from his brutal dismemberment to his and Bajazeth's funeral, while the comic business involving Bulla Thrumble is characteristic of Greene, and he seems to have written most of the concluding passages. So the collaboration was evidently very close, just as in A Looking Glass for London and England. And it's conceivable that some passages contain both dramatists' hands, but I think that the author's respective contributions can, on the whole, be delineated through fundamental differences in rhyming habits and through close examination of linguistic commonalities.
So we've got two potentials left. I think we can probably knock an act and an Ave out of the running fairly quickly. But you include Locrine as an option, perhaps. Thoughts on those last two plays before we move on to our a little more detail on another play?
Yeah, so I think Locrine is solely Greene, which was a surprise to myself, to be honest, because I always thought that the play sounded like George Peele. But Locrine fits neatly into every single test I conducted. I think the case I've made for Greene's sole authorship, as opposed to other contenders like George Peele or Thomas Lodge, is pretty solid. As for an act and a knave, yeah, I think you can knock that one on the head pretty quickly. I mean, the association of that play with Greene stems chiefly from the theory that it can be identified as the comedy referred to in Greene's pamphlet, Groat's Worth of Wit, with the young juvenile most likely being Nashe. Greene writes, "With thee I join young juvenile, that biting satirist that lastly with me together writ a comedy." Now, Nax Noah Knave, as a Strangers Men play, certainly exhibits the influence of Greene, as other plays in that repertory do. But I don't think there's any compelling internal evidence to give that one to Greene. So I think we have a canon, according to my argument, of 7 plays now. 7 Greene plays as opposed to 5, and 2 of which are co-authored plays.
So we're going to narrow our focus down to the play Alphonsus, not to be confused with Alphonsus, Emperor of Germany, which is a different play. We have done by the time this goes out, a first and second look run at the text. So we've looked at it in a little bit of detail, and we've run it for pace to find out how it flows. Those exploring sessions are on the YouTube channel. Links are in the show notes. So there are some very good reasons why doing a full production of this play is tricky. But one day, Alphonsus, we shall see. So Alphonsus, you've already mentioned it was written, probably one of his earliest surviving plays. What's going on with Alphonsus? What dare we ask, what's it all about?
I always feel like doing that movie trailer voice. 20 years before the action of the play, but I'll refrain from doing that. But what's happening in Alphonsus, King of Aragon? Well, 2 decades before the action of the play, Alphonsus's father, Carinus, was usurped by the treacherous Duke of Milan, and Alphonsus was prevented from inheriting the throne. So Carinus, now an old man, and Alphonsus live in Italy in exile. And Alphonsus decides to recapture the throne for his father. Now, conveniently, the army of Aragon has invaded Italy, and Alphonsus disguises himself as a common soldier and enters the service of Belinus, whose army is defending Naples from the usurping king of Aragon, Flaminius. And Alphonsus persuades Belinus to grant him the crown of Aragon, after which he claims sovereignty over Naples. And having given the crowns of Naples and Aragon away, Alphonsus resolves to conquer Italy and then Turkey, where Belinus has fled to the court of Amurac. And later in the play, Alphonsus and his father Carinus are reunited. And Carinus helps Alphonsus to woo Iphigenia, who is Amurac and Fausta's daughter. And there's an incredible attempt, slightly earlier in the play, by Alphonsus to woo Iphigenia on the battlefield. And when she rejects him, Alphonsus has a hissy fit and threatens to execute her. And at the end of the play, Carinus soothes his son's wounded pride by pointing out that castles are not won at first assault, and women are not wooed when first their suitors proffer love to them. So we have a comic resolution to the play, characterized by union and reunion. And it's in this sense that the play is comic. It's hardly a rib tickler, Robert. I think you'll agree.
Well, I mean, we were discussing this in passing, I think, the other day, that, you know, if there is elements that are, if there are elements that are explicitly supposed to be comic, they're deeply problematic elements, because it's, look at this other culture and their silly rituals, which we have completely bowdlerized in so many terrifying ways, which is just, yeah. This is the big problem for us as a group, is that, you know, we're about doing these plays today. This is a very challenging text to do beyond Act 2 today. We hit Act 3 and it suddenly throws curveballs, which make it very hard to work with. And on paper, this could be called a history play, as it were. And there's a lot of plays that are dealing with not just English history, classical history, we've mentioned in passing, but world history, the wider world, in ways that, you know, today are either fascinating or disturbing. So is Alphonsus interested in history, or is it just a backdrop for what Greene wants to do? I mean, because he has form here of, you know, in theory setting things in history. You know, James IV coming up, you know, there's some kings, and they're you know, you can align it with some history, but I wouldn't really try to look too hard. And same with Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. You know, in theory, again, based on real people in part. But yeah, so how much is this is a history play?
Well, there's an editor of Robert Greene's plays, Thomas H. Dickinson, observed that Greene had always been interested in that historical figure of Alfonso or Alphonsus, or at least as early as 1584, because he mentions that figure in the dedication to his pamphlet, The Card of Fancy. But the play's narrative only loosely adheres to the life of either Alphonsus I of Naples or the Fifth of Aragon. I think it's fair to say, actually, that the narrative is so distorted that it's difficult to establish which historical figure Greene was even bringing to the Elizabethan stage. I think Greene seems to have spent very little time consulting specific source materials for Alphonsus, King of Aragon, such as Barthélemy Fasio's Memoirs of Alfonso V. I think Greene preferred to come up with a largely original plot line. And I think it's fair to say that Greene's neglect of the best historical evidence is symptomatic of his approach to history in general. As in the examples from his other plays, like your James the Fourths and Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay attest. Now, Alphonsus, King of Aragon, has sometimes been regarded as this shameless attempt to capitalize on Christopher Marlowe's loose accounts of the life of Central Asian Emperor Timur in his Tamburlaine the Great play. But the London theatrical scene was, as Thomas H. Dickinson rightly points out, a system of community of ideas in which Greene was entirely at home. Of this we have abundant evidence in his often displayed ability to feel the popular pulse and to make himself a part of every growing movement, Dickinson concludes. And so in this respect, Greene was neither more nor less of an imitator than his fellows.
And especially as, of course, we have all these gaps in our knowledge as to what other plays might be about at the time that may add additional ideas of, where these ideas are coming from and who's riffing off who. And, I always wonder, is there just a game of writers sitting around down in the pub just going, yeah, well, I can do that scene better than you, and in a both competitive but also a sort of fun way. There is a community of workers.
Absolutely. I think it was an intensely competitive period. That unique period of flourishing London theatres, but it was also very much a collaborative period. And I think those dramatists trying to better each other is just wonderful for audiences, isn't it? Because they're trying to top each other, they're trying to innovate, and they're conflating genres and they're retelling history. And I think that makes for great entertainment for Elizabethan audiences and modern audiences, I guess.
And of course all the various techniques that you can throw into a text, because we tend to get bogged down in the words, but Greene really isn't afraid to use spectacle, to use props, to use disguising, and Alphonsus is not a play. Has a big talking head, which is maybe recycled or later on as a prop, and because once you've got a big giant talking head, you want to use it because it's taking.
You never go back.
Yeah, well, it's taking up room in the prop store once you commission something like that. Assuming it was commissioned for this, it is obviously a very problematic big talking head, but. Any thoughts on the stage effects of Alphonsus?
Well, we just begin at the beginning, really, with the play opens with this striking theatrical device of Venus being let down from the top of the stage, and at the conclusion of the play, we're treated to the image of a chair drawing Venus upwards. I think.
If you can conveniently, I believe.
If you can conveniently, yes.
On tour, don't bother.
I want to elaborate on that, actually, shortly. But to quote Thomas H. Dickinson again, he rightly noted that in the case of the descending throne and the use of other pieces of stage machinery, such as the trapdoor, property tomb, balcony and curtain, Greene illustrates the best practice of his time. Now later playhouses, in particular, seem to have featured stage covers and heavens, which offered opportunities for ascent and descent, particularly during the appearance of gods or allegorical personages. But I think we can't dismiss such calls for machinery as immaturity on Greene's part, because a couple of years later, we witnessed similar calls for ascent and descent in A Looking Glass for London and England. But you pointed out Greene's very polite stage directions, which you think, is this Greene just trying to ingratiate himself with the actors right at the beginning of his dramatic writing career? But it's a habit that we witness in stage directions in his later plays as well. You've got a fiddler who's permitted to sing any old toy in Orlando Furioso, And you've got the certain huntsmen who enter the stage, if you please, singing in James the Fourth. So I think we've got really quirky stage directions in Greene's plays, which I think strongly point towards the notion that those stage directions are authorial, and Greene has a real say in the stagecraft of his plays, in his descriptive stage directions. And you mentioned earlier that brazen heads. So we've got another example of Greene's spectacular stagecraft in the direction, let there be a brazen head set in the middle of the place behind the stage, out of the which cast flames of fire, drums rumble within. So stagehands could employ pyrotechnics to depict fire emanating from this brazen head, even flames being belched out by hell's mouth. And as you mentioned, in that reuse of the brazen head prop in Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, we get a sense of theatrical economy and stage expediency, sometimes overlooked in studies of Greene's dramaturgy. Greene was clearly aware of what props his company had at their disposal, and was possibly aware that this brazen head, this old Muhammad's head, as the theatre impresario Philip Henslow lists it in his diary, was an expensive prop that necessitated reuse. And I guess what I'm saying here, Rob, is that Greene was clearly more theatrically minded than is sometimes articulated in scholarship on his relationship with the playing companies. He's sometimes regarded as this fustian literary figure who tries his hand at theatre, but I think he was far more aware of the strengths, the limitations, and the constraints of the commercial stage.
There's a real pragmatic structuring to it as well. The whole Brazenhead sequence is during a sequence, it's sort of isolated from a lot of the rest of the action. The number of actors who are on stage, depending on how many supernumeraries you want to add, is relatively controlled. So you can have enough spare bodies going, okay, you work the whatever we need to make the flames work, or get the effect to do what it is, if necessary. It's also isolated in the sense of that flow of where that scene is going and where musicians might need to live as well. There's a real thought of where personnel need to be, which I think is very important. And again, that question of those stage directions, just hinting at, well, if you've got enough people to do this, you can do it this way. If not, the scene will survive with just a person coming on, or that kind of stage direction, which is again very useful. As the idea of what are these plays like in their best practice in a playhouse? What are they like if they go on tour? What if they're like in a house? Where the context of what you can put on stage will be different, and will the plays then survive that? And it seems probably it does. We've gone a little long, so we've got a few follow-on thoughts, questions. We've sort of drifted into it, this idea of what the company's bringing to it, the competition doing, his contemporaries are bringing to his work, that there is a collaborative quality going on between everyone. You've suggested that he's very Queen's Men focused. Do you think there's a company style that may be imposing itself or suggesting itself to his work, or is it more the other way around, or can we know, because we have so little data on the repertoire of the Queen's Men? In terms of Greene working within a company framework, if he's working primarily for the Queen's Men, how much is coming from the company imposing perhaps a style, and also what's he taking from collaborators? How much give and take is there with Greene?
I think that's a really great question. It's quite a tricky one to answer. I think critics have been apt to dismiss Greene's visual style, calling it a substitute for intellectual substance. But we should acknowledge that Greene's development of dramatic conventions and theatrical tropes reveals him to be an innovative playwright whose plays have the power to both entertain and instruct audiences through lively action. Now, the Queen's Men's dramaturgy was generally characterized by visual drama and by over-plotted stories, whereas we see a a movement towards more auditory techniques and imagistic verse in plays by other companies, such as the Admiral's Men and Pembroke's Men. But Greene, as Scott Macmillan and Sally Beth McLean note in their wonderful book on the Queen's Men Playing Company, was particularly innovative in the context of that company's output and dramaturgy, because he employed a fully articulated blank verse style and a willingness to let metaphorical statements take the place of narrative explanation. And we were talking about the brazen head, for instance. You know, it's worth noting that this prop is likely to have been reused as part of a romantic narrative in the Lost Queen's Men play, Valentine and Orson, possibly revived by Admiral's Men at the Rose Theatre in the summer of 1598, which would link both of Greene's text to the former company, to the Queen's Men. A talking brazen head appears in a prose version of the medieval romance narrative that likely served as a source for Valentine and Orson. So you've got this brazen head in different plays, likely by different dramatists, and you know that the very existence of that prop, as you point out, necessitates reuse. So I think it's difficult to give a clear-cut answer. You know, Greene's dramaturgy is of course influenced by company considerations and commercial rivalry, but he's also highly distinctive in the ways in which he goes about presenting and exploring theatrical tropes, and the ways in which he integrates his habitual phraseology in surrounding verbal texture and stage directions. You know, Greene's visual theatre is unmistakable, I think, and you know when it's Greene behind the use of this brazen head prop, to offer just one more instance. So I think Greene had a much more profound influence on his contemporaries than is often credited, but it was a community, as we noted earlier.
Sadly, I'm going to have to close the session here. We had more questions to ask, but I'm sure we'll come back to this, because that's one of the things we do. We always come back to the scene of the crime to find out more and discuss more about other Greene plays and other things that he was doing. Just to close the session, do you have any future projects, hopes, dreams? I know you've got various books in the pipeline that you'd like to tell our listeners about.
So I've got a book on Robert Greene called Reading Robert Greene, Recovering Shakespeare's Rival, which I hope will be out in 2022. I've also got a book called Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd, which seeks to delimit Thomas Kyd's canon and analyse his influence on Shakespeare's dramas. I'm associate editor for a forthcoming edition of Thomas Kyd's works, and I'm hoping, you know, one of my dreams, one of my fancies, is to eventually pitch a new edition of Robert Greene's plays, which I'll be looking for editors at some point. So watch this space, as they say.
Excellent. I look forward to all of these things, and thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and chatting through some terrible technical problems we've had today. So hopefully it's all going to edit together in a beautiful fashion for the listeners at home. All that remains is to thank my guest for joining us today, and thank you for listening. Thank you very much, and goodbye.